When I was in university, I took a course on Greek tragedy since it was both mandatory for my degree and because I was curious about what kind of stories tragedies tended to tell, especially if they were made for political reasons such as the Maenads and even the Persians. However, one particular tragedy stuck out to me the most due to it having been loosely adapted by Studio Trigger in the form of the movie Promare, which came out in 2019. Keep in mind, I was still in university when this movie came out. At the time, I didn't really look into it, but I did like the art style as well as the plot, given how epic and crazy it was, as you can expect from Studio Trigger. It wasn't until I took a look at TV tropes, as usual, did I realize how many Greek tragedy and mythology references were placed in that movie. Take the title itself for example, Promare. Given how the movie focuses on fire as its main theme, especially with the majority of the characters being Burnish, who were humans that were gifted, or rather cursed in their case, into becoming pyrokinetic entities whose abilities unfortunately led to the world being placed in a half-burnt state known as the Great World Blaze, and led to mass persecution by the rest of humanity because of it. It becomes quite clear that the movie is a reference to Prometheus, the titan who brought fire to humans. As a result, the now pyrokinetic humans were labeled Burnish by the non-superpowered humans and were either forced into isolation, hiding, or resort to terrorism in order to survive, with the main antagonist being the Mad Burnish group who seek to bring freedom to the Burnish and put an end to the persecution once and for all. From what I can find in this movie, there seems to be a lot of references to the famous Greek tragedy play Prometheus Bound by Aeschylus, which debuted at around 479 to 424 BC. As the title implies, it is based on the titan Prometheus, who was famous for bringing fire to humans and teaching them how to make it themselves, which unfortunately led to him being chained to a mountain and having an eagle tear into his flesh for the next few centuries. The play is somewhat minimalist, but it does feature some iconic and not so iconic characters from the original Greek myths, such as Hephaestus, Kratos, no, not that Kratos, Bia, the Oceanids, their father Oceanus, Io, and Hermes. Though Zeus is mentioned multiple times and is the one who strikes lightning at Prometheus, which leads to him being buried under boulders and sinking into the underworld, he's never actually seen in the play, which is rather ironic since he's the one who is the cause of Prometheus's suffering and punishment. As for the play itself, it involves Prometheus mostly being tormented by Kratos and Bia, warning everyone, especially Zeus, that the thunder god's reign will come to an end someday, foreshadowing the event where Heracles will free Prometheus from his prison, and the events of the suppliants after meeting Io in her cow form, being pitied by the Oceanids and Oceanus for his current state, arguing with Hermes over whether it is best to reveal the event that will end Zeus's reign or not, and finally, being buried alive and sent down into Tartarus to suffer even more. Fun fact, The Suppliants was a play that was also made by Aeschylus, though chronologically speaking, it took place years after the events of Prometheus Bound, because it features the Danaids, who were the 50 daughters of King Danaus, who himself is a descendant of Io, hence their connection to Prometheus Bound. Also, Heracles is distantly related to them as well, hence why Prometheus reveals to Io that one of her descendants will eventually free him from his punishment, which actually happens in the lost sequels Prometheus Unbound, and presumably Prometheus the Firebringer. Now, as for said sequels, it's been debated as to what exactly the plots were about due to how they had been reduced to fragments with its contents being lost to time. But from what historians and researchers can find, they seem to involve Prometheus meeting up with the rest of the Titans who are also sympathetic to his plight, with their conversation foreshadowing how they, along with Prometheus, will eventually be freed by Zeus despite the whole titanomachy that happened between them. Also, as the title implies, it would have eventually involved Heracles coming to free Prometheus as predicted, though the Titan and Thunder God have yet to reconcile thanks to the whole imprisonment thing. As for Prometheus the Firebringer, nobody knows what the story was about, since all that was left of the play was this fragment that says, and I quote, "Quiet where need is," and talking to the point. Yeah, that's basically it. I don't know what to say. Funny thing is that I actually read both Prometheus Bound and The Suppliant, as it was part of my curriculum at university, since I took a lot of classic courses, both out of interest and because, as I said earlier, it was mandatory for my degree. Now for Promare, several characters have names and roles that can basically serve as allusions, if not outright references, to the original play, as well as Greek mythology and tragedy in general. The true villain of Promare, and spoilers if you haven't seen the movie and wish to check it out for yourselves, Cray Foresight, gets his first name from Kratos, the god of strength, albeit of the brutish kind. As for Cray himself, he is a treacherous Burnish who seeks to play the role of the savior of humanity by transporting them to another dimension away from the scorched earth, even if it means sacrificing hundreds, if not thousands, of Burnish in the process. Then again, considering he is the big bad of the movie and is willing to do anything to keep himself in power, he may very well be the closest thing we have to Zeus from the original play. The fact that the Burnish that were being sacrificed end up being imprisoned, similar to Prometheus, makes the comparison even more fitting, especially when he shows his true colors. Also, his personal assistant, Br Colossus' name is a reference to not only Kratos' partner, Bia, the god of violence, albeit a gender-inverted version, but also a reference to the famous statue, the Colossus of Rhodes, which was actually meant to be the sun god Helios. But considering how the sun is known for having a fiery exterior, it can still fit in with the movie's fire themes. Ironically, compared to Cray, BR doesn't really do much in the movie compared to the others, which is weird because the ads seem to hint that she would play a big role in the story. Another villainous character who has ties to Prometheus Bound is Vulcan Hestus, who is the brutish enforcer of the Freeze Force, a group of military soldiers who work directly under Cray and prefer a more extreme method in fighting the Burnish compared to burning rescue and constantly steal credit for the latter's success. If the name didn't tip you off, he is based on Hephaestus, albeit a more villainous version, since his first name is based on the Roman version of Hephaestus known as Vulcan, whereas his last name is basically a shortened version of his Greek name. Vulcan is noticeable for taking a bit too much pleasure in taking down the Burnish and anyone he doesn't like, as it's clear that the power given to him by Cray has gone into his head, especially with all that tech on him. Ironically, Hephaestus in the original play and myth was reluctant to trap Prometheus, and only did so because Zeus ordered him to, thus making him a bit more sympathetic compared to Kratos and Bia. Then again, there have been some villainous depictions of Hephaestus in other media, such as God of War and American Gods, but even then, the former was still more sympathetic than the latter. Not just that, in some myths, he's portrayed as, unfortunately, being just as rapey as Zeus, as in one myth regarding Erycthonius, the founder of Athens itself. He tried to force himself onto Athena after she rejected his affections. Interestingly enough, one of my classic teachers mentioned this myth, but she seemed to go for the one where Poseidon tried to assault Athena rather than Hephaestus. When I told her about the Hephaestus version, she was surprised to hear it because she apparently didn't know about that version until I told her. Also, Vulcan's role in imprisoning the Burnish for the Foresight Foundation can also be a loose reference to the 1623 oil painting Prometheus being chained by Vulcan, which happens to use the Roman name for Hephaestus. But if you ask me, he probably fulfills the Kratos role more than the actual Cray. Also, an interesting thing to note is that the volcano which the movie shows a couple of times is referred to as Fennel Volcano, which is also a reference to how, supposedly, Prometheus tried to hide the fire he stole from Zeus inside a fennel before presenting it to humanity. Considering how the Burnish try to hide their remaining kin inside, only to unfortunately get caught after one of them sells them out to the Freeze Force, it does seem fitting in a thematic sense. Plus, there's that poor Burnish girl Thema, who unfortunately becomes the sacrificial lamb of the movie thanks to getting killed by the the Foresight Foundation, as her name literally means victim and can allude to how Greek tragedies usually have at least one character who suffers a tragic fate, even if they aren't the main protagonist. Then again, she did get some focus in the Leo side story before dying, so that probably counts as her being the protagonist. Plus, the city of Prometheus, and even the titular Promare, who are actually sentient alien flames that took refuge in the Earth's core before connecting with humans in order to survive, thus turning them into burnished, are also references to Prometheus himself, if the first half of their names didn't give it away. The fact that the Promare took refuge underground before becoming freed can also be a reference to Prometheus Unbound, where the latter ended up being in Tartarus before eventually getting freed by Heracles. Also, the city of Prometheus has the word polis in it, which means city in Greek. Then again, at the end of the movie, when the Promare are freed by Leo and the other burnished, I guess it can also be referenced to how Prometheus was freed from his prison. But in this case, the Promare end up going back to their original dimension, as they got stuck in the Earth thanks to a dimensional rift that occurred years ago. Finally, we get to a very special character who plays a huge role in the movie near the end, and is literally named Deus Promet. Yeah, they didn't even bother changing his name that much, and literally spelled out that he was inspired by Prometheus himself. His name is also referenced to not only Zeus, since Deus was an alternate spelling for his name in some translations, but is also a reference to the phrase Deus Ex Machina. As for why the latter gets referenced, it is explained that Deus built a giant mech suit he had been hiding from Cray after the latter murdered him for getting in the way of his plans, thus reducing him to an AI copy, which gets used by the heroes later on to stop Cray, and is labeled Deus Ex Machina as a result. Interestingly enough, his mech's name is a reference to the ancient Greek plays, as the phrase actually came from a technique where stagehands would use certain mechanisms behind the stage in order to lift people up should they play the role of gods or ascended divine beings. One famous example can be the infamous depiction of Medea at the end of the tragedy of the same name, who rides on a chariot driven by dragons, but not before chastising Jason for his infidelity and hypocrisy. Also, another reference to how Prometheus was sent underground can be seen in how Gallo, Leo, and even Ina meet Deus in the process, as they accidentally discovered his underground lab, which was hidden by a frozen lake that Leo managed to melt through thanks to going on a rampage earlier. While Prometheus wasn't buried underground through ice per se, the similarities to how Deus was buried underwater, just like how the old Titan was buried under boulders and rocks, makes the reference pretty clear. The fact that it was also caused by a chain of events involving them getting unjustly punished by a villainous leader figure makes the similarities even more fitting in hindsight. Ironically though, Deus shares the same name as Zeus, who is the villain of the play the movie is loosely based on. Interestingly enough, Deus was the first to discover the existence of the Promare, and even gave them their name to begin with, hence the title. So it can also be a reference to how Prometheus helped humanity discover fire, though in this case, it wasn't necessarily a good thing for humanity to gain the ability to burn everything in their path. Overall, I find the idea that Studio Trigger managed to loosely adapt an old tragedy play that is rather obscure even compared to most Greek mythology stories pretty interesting and surprising in a good way. A part of me hopes that more people would know about this play along with this movie, since I considered it to be worthy forms of media to watch or read. Also helps that I'm able to use what I learned in university for this video's topic too, so there's that.